Chapter 3. Port Blair, where Caroline Bender lived with her family, is a town situated along the line of the New Haven Railroad and is distinguished by its utter lack of pleasant suburban qualities. Its major industries are a candy factory and a street of small modern bars and small old-fashioned whorehouses. In the evenings, its population swells with visitors from the snootier neighborhoods, mostly domestic help, and chauffeurs from the homes and estates of nearby Greenwich, Scarsdale, Portchester, and Larchmont. The police roam in prowl cars picking up anyone suspicious-looking, and on Monday mornings, especially after such big weekends as July 4th and Memorial Day, the court is overflowing. In the very center of town, there is an 8-block square oasis of large, beautiful homes, tree-lined streets, and jealously guarded privacy, which 50 years ago was the original town of Port Blair. The gin mills, the honky-tonks, the cheap cafes all came later, at first slowly, and then, as the candy factory was established rapidly and vigorously, surrounding the old suburban area, but never succeeding in choking it off. The people who live in this 8-square-block area are the doctors, the lawyers, the large business owners, and the most prosperous tradespeople of the town. They hide their homes behind tall hedges and send their children away to camp and summer resorts and college, but they always send their children to the Port Blair Public High School, because if they didn't, they would be considered snobs and it would be bad for business. Caroline's father was a physician, and he had inherited the large colonial-style house where they lived, and his practice, from his father. Caroline's mother came from a middle-class family in New York City. She and her husband had met at a college dance when he was attending medical school, and she was an undergraduate. They went steady immediately, were married as soon as he was graduated, and after his internship, they moved to Port Blair. At the time, the new Mrs. Bender was delighted to live in what seemed to her to be the country, but she soon changed her mind. The narrow life, the small selection of close friends, the ugly little town, depressed her, and she determined that her daughter and young son would end up New Yorkers, as she was, or at least in a better part of Westchester. It was Mrs. Bender who insisted that Caroline go to Radcliffe, to be near Harvard boys, and it was Mrs. Bender who sat up with Caroline night after night to see that she learned her Latin verbs, Caroline's weakest subject, so that she would get a high mark on her college board exams and be accepted. Her son Mark was 6 years younger than Caroline, so she did not have to do anything about him at present, but she was already worrying and planning secretly to have him break out of the Port Blair High School mold and spend his senior year at least at Lawrenceville. It was not that she was a social climber. It was simply that she considered life in Port Blair a dead-end street to many of the things that made life rewarding and stimulating, and she did not want her children to get to like it. That would have been easy. The younger generation enjoyed life in Port Blair. They had their own friends, their parties, their groping romances. But Mrs. Bender remembered something different and, to her, infinitely more desirable. Although Mrs. Bender mourned the end of her daughter's engagement to Eddie Harris, it was not for the same reasons Caroline did. She was not a sentimental woman, and because her daughter was beautiful and talented and only 20 years old, she was sure that another fiancé would appear in due time. What was one Eddie Harris? One college senior looked like another to her. They were all uninformed. You could only guess what their futures would be. It was true that Eddie had a great deal of charm for a boy his age. He was poised, and he knew how to talk to older people as if he really enjoyed it. His musical talent was negligible. He played the piano the way the boys in her day had played the mandolin. She could picture him better in public relations, perhaps, or in advertising. He came from a good family, he was attractive, and with his education and ambition, she would have liked to see him as a husband for Caroline. When he sent Caroline that letter from Europe, Mrs. Bender decided immediately that he was immature, flighty, and selfish. Her major regret was that Caroline had spent so much time at college with him when she could have been meeting other desirable boys. It would not be so easy to meet friends, her euphemism for a good catch, in Port Blair after graduation. When Caroline expressed a wish to find a job in New York, Mrs. Bender was proud of her for taking the whole unhappy affair so well. She knew Caroline had no particular career ambitions, but nowadays a girl had to work even if she didn't need the money. You didn't stay home and rot, especially if you lived in a place like Port Blair, and rot was the word, Mrs. Bender said, for what would happen to a girl in Port Blair. Dr. Bender was a typical small-town doctor, despite the fact that Port Blair was nothing like a typical small town. He liked people, and people liked him, coming to him with their family troubles as well as their physical ailments. He was the kind of man who is more appreciated by his friends than by his family. The women who came to him with their aches and pains, real or imaginary, went away sighing enviously for that lucky Mrs. Bender, the doctor's wife. He was such a gentle, giving-in sort of man, and he gave so much of himself to his patients and their silly, tedious problems that he had very little left to give to his family. He never took his son to a football game. He often fell asleep right after dinner, in front of the television set, or with a medical magazine in his hands, and then, like as not, he would be aroused an hour later for an emergency house call. Almost the only girl in town who didn't confide in Dr. Bender was his daughter Caroline. She confided exclusively in her mother, and her mother came to guard this privilege with something that was very like jealousy. It was often, "Your father doesn't know about those things." And Dr. Bender, who loved and respected his wife very much, came to say more and more often, "Ask Mother. She knows," until finally, there was no more reason for him to have to say it at all. When Caroline brought home the manuscript the night of her first day at Fabian, it was her mother she told. And when she read it and found to her amazement that she did not agree with Amanda Farrow's comments at all, but found the novel to be boring in spite of its facile style, it was her mother she consulted. "I read this book last night, Mother." "Well, a manuscript, really. They're probably going to publish it because Miss Farrow said it was wonderful. I read it and I thought it was downright dull. Do you think I'm in the wrong field? I thought I knew about literature, but this book really put me to sleep. Maybe there's a secret about paperback books." "You always had good taste," her mother said staunchly. "A book is just a book as far as I can see. Everybody's entitled to his own opinion. I never could stand The Scarlet Letter myself, and that's a classic." This reminded Mrs. Bender of an English literature course she had taken in college and what the professor had said to her, and she went off into one of her lengthy, nostalgic anecdotes about college, which was one of her ways of escaping temporarily from life in Port Blair. Caroline had heard the story before, and many others very much like it, and she finished her breakfast coffee drifting off into her own thoughts. They would more than likely publish the manuscript, but she thought it was so dreadful. Was it any of her business? But she'd read it. The manuscript was due to go next to Mr. Shalimar, the editor-in-chief, and it was she who was supposed to put it on his desk. If she were to type up a comment sheet with her personal opinion of the manuscript, the worst he could do would be to throw it away and tell her to stay in her place. He wouldn't fire her. He would understand the over-enthusiasm of a novice on her first job, and she might just possibly be right, or at least worth listening to. Perhaps he would let her read some other manuscripts. With her comment in such complete opposition to Miss Farrow's, she had to know if she was on the right track, otherwise it was all too bewildering. Her editorial hopes, her beginning feelings of responsibility toward the company. "I'm late," she said, kissing her mother on the cheek. She took the envelope and headed for the door. "Oh, I forgot. I won't be home for dinner. I'm going to eat with a girl from the office." "Oh? Someone interesting?" I hope so, Caroline said, smiling. So long. She was 10 minutes early for her train, and she stood on the outdoor platform, watching her breath go off in puffs of smoke on the cold, clear air. Up ahead, where the smoker would stop, were the men who commuted every day. Very few, however, because most of the men who lived in Port Blair worked in Port Blair. There was Stan Rogers, hung over, leaning against one of the station pillars, his eyes heavy-lidded, his face pink and shiny with razor scrape. He had been a year ahead of Caroline at the high school, which made him Eddie Harris's age, and he had married a Port Blair girl right after graduation. They now had 4 children, the oldest of whom was 3.5. His shoes were so worn and scuffed, she could notice it from here, and she recognized his jalopy parked in the station lot as the same one that had so impressed the girls his senior year at the high. And there were the Litchfield sisters, one fat and one thin, who always dressed identically, as if they thought they were twins, or 7 years old instead of 30, and who worked as comptometer operators in an insurance company. She nodded at them and began to stroll in the other direction. There was someone she didn't expect to see on a commuter train, Mrs. Nature, a friend of her mother's, and wife of the local dry cleaning king. Clothes cleaned the nature way, their signs read, and people who saw them thought it was some new, mysterious, and healthful process. Actually, the owner of the shops, there were 4, was named Francis P. Nature. He was now one of the wealthiest men in town. "Caroline, yoo-hoo!" Mrs. Nature was waving at her. Caroline walked over to her. "I'm so glad to see you, Caroline. I was going to call you up tonight, but now I won't have to. I took the liberty of telling a young man to call you up." "Oh?" "He used to go out with Francine. Oh, not seriously, but just once in a while. She thought he was quite nice." Since Mrs. Nature had married off her only daughter, she had mellowed to the extent of sending all her daughter's old beaux to the other single girls in her group. Caroline had never cared much for Francine, an extremely loud and nervous girl, and she was not particularly delighted at the prospect of one of Francine's cast-offs. "His name is Alvin Wiggs," Mrs. Nature went on. "Now, you may hate each other. I don't know, and I never make promises. I always say to the girls, it's only one evening out of your life, and I'm not sending you a husband. Of course, if it works out, and you do find you're just crazy about each other, I'd be delighted." Alvin Wiggs, Caroline thought. Mrs. Alvin Wiggs. God help us. "Is he attractive?" she asked. "You may think so. Francine thought he was very attractive. I always say looks are the same as anything else. It's a matter of taste. He's going to call you at your office. He might even call you up today because I gave him your number last night. As I say, I never make promises, and you may hate each other, but I think he's a lovely boy." "Well, it was very nice of you to think of me," Caroline said politely. It would have been nicer, she was thinking, if Mrs. Nature had asked her first if she wanted anyone to call her up. "What does he do?" "He's in his family's business," Mrs. Nature said. "He works for his father. They're in the mannequin business." There was the 8:05 roaring into the station. As usual, it stopped too far ahead of the station platform, and everyone had to run to board it. Caroline and Mrs. Nature ran alongside each other, not really together, not really apart. "Oh, I just hate this train," Mrs. Nature panted. "But I have to go into New York to send some wedding gifts. I can't put it off any longer. So many of my friends' daughters have gotten married." "I'm going to sit in the smoking car," Caroline said. "Oh. Well, I'll see you then. I can't stand the smoker. Call me up and tell me how you like Alvin." They parted, waving, and Caroline crept into the last seat in the car, next to the window. She looked out through the dusty, smeared glass and watched as the station and then the outskirts of Port Blair slipped past. Blind dates. She could not decide which was worse, the anticipation or the final actuality. A year ago, 6 months ago, she had thought she was through forever with the unholy three of the single girl. Loneliness, being unprotected, and blind dates. Now it had started again. By the time she had ridden up in the elevator at Fabian, Caroline had forgotten the blind date and was caught up again in her working world feeling. Half thrill, half uneasiness. As she passed through the reception room, she noticed a girl about her own age sitting nervously on the edge of one of the couches, wearing a hat. She must be job hunting, Caroline thought. The hat gave her away. Caroline and the girls she knew wore hats for only 2 occasions, going to a wedding or looking for a job. As soon as they were hired, they put their hats back in the closet and did not wear them to the office again until, and if, they had attained the eminence of a Miss Farrow, and then they wore them all the time in the office. I wonder if that girl out there will be Miss Farrow's next secretary, Caroline thought, putting a fresh comment sheet into her typewriter, because I sure hope it won't have to be me. She put the manuscript with Miss Farrow's and her own comments on Mr. Shalimar's unoccupied desk quickly before she lost her courage and returned to her desk. The girls in the bullpen were engaged in their morning coffee ritual. She wondered whether any of them ever ate breakfast at home, especially the married ones, or whether even those never had time to feed their working husbands and themselves in the mornings. Brenda, who was currently buying her trousseau, had brought in the latest purchase, a white lace nightgown, and had put it on her desk in its open box so that all the other girls could see it. "Look at that," Mary Agnes whispered. "She must have 45 nightgowns by now. She buys something new every lunch hour and always puts it on her desk for everybody to ogle at. I don't know who's interested in her trousseau anyway." My goodness, Caroline thought. The frantic buying, the storing up, the preparations. She won't have any money left for after she's married. But she's probably spent her whole life building up to her wedding and never thinks about all the time that goes on afterward. She had known girls like Brenda in Port Blair, the girls who thought life stopped on their wedding day in that one moment of perfect achievement, like the figures in Keats's poem about the Greek vase. She thought for an instant of the girl Eddie had married and wondered what Helen Harris was doing right now. She forced the thought out of her mind. She wasn't going to think about Eddie and Helen. It was over for her. It was none of her business. Let them do what they wanted. Wake up, go to sleep, make love. She wasn't going to sit here and say to herself, "What time is it in Dallas? What are they doing now?" That was a good way to make yourself morbid. She had her own life now, too. She was working. She was trying to work her way up to a more interesting job. She would sit here and wait for Mr. Shalimar to come in and look at Brenda's new nightgown looking so out of place alongside her typewriter and filing cards and amuse herself wondering what kind of man Brenda was buying all these goodies for. Some moose face, probably. The usual procession of latecomers was straggling in through the door. Mr. Rice, in that wonderful camel's hair overcoat, with his clear-cut profile beginning to fade away a little at the edges. His eyes were slits this morning, and there was a little cut with dried blood at the corner of his mouth. He paused as usual for a long drink at the water fountain and found his way to his office like a sleepwalker. "Psst, look at that." Mary Agnes prodded her, shocked. "Our eminent religious editor," Caroline whispered, after a struggle with the devil. She didn't know, a moment after she'd said it, why she had felt compelled to make fun of him. Actually, he fascinated her, in a way. Perhaps that was why she had said it. "The devil?" Mary Agnes whispered back scornfully. "He hangs around in those Third Avenue bars all night, drinking and reciting poetry and talking to every stranger he can lay his hands on. One of them probably hit him." "Doesn't he have a home?" Caroline asked. "A wife?" "He had a wife, but she left him. It's very sad. He lives in a real run-down hotel on the West Side. He's divorced and he has a daughter 10 years old who he never sees. He writes to her all the time. I know because his secretary told me. He used to dictate these long, long letters, all about life and love and people and stuff. Sort of advice for when she grows up. That's because he thinks he'll never see her again. I can just imagine the kind of advice he'd give to a child. 10 years old seems young for a child of his, Caroline said. How old do you think he is? About 48, I would guess. He's 38. He looks that way because he lives such an unhealthy life, Mary Agnes added disapprovingly. If he was married and lived with his wife and child, he wouldn't look that way. Marriage solves everything? Caroline asked. What a funny thing to say. Why is it funny? Well, Mary Agnes said, there are only two ways to live, the right way and the wrong way. If you live the right way, you're happy, and if you live the wrong way, you're miserable. If you get married, it doesn't mean positively you're going to be happy, but if you get married and walk out on it, then you can't be happy. You'll always know you gave up on a responsibility. What if the other person walks out on you? Mr. Rice should have tried harder. How do you know he didn't? Well, that's a funny thing to think, Mary Agnes said. You don't even know him. I know it, Caroline said. Maybe he was a beast. I'm only saying I know about being walked out on. Sometimes trying doesn't make the least bit of difference. It's almost as if there aren't two people involved at all. Mary Agnes looked at her, her eyes widening. Were you married? Number engaged? Mary Agnes glanced at Caroline's left hand. Oh, how terrible! How terrible! Well, don't you get upset about it, Caroline said, smiling. You poor thing, Mary Agnes said. I'll never talk about it again, unless you bring it up. If you ever want to talk about it, you just tell me. And you'll tell everyone else on the 35th floor, Caroline thought, amused. Mary Agnes's air of tragedy made her begin to feel that her problems really weren't so pitiable after all. There is something to be said for someone else's exaggerated sympathy. If it happens to fall a little far afield, it makes the original problem seem a bit remote and not quite worth it. Or maybe that's the first sign of health, she thought. If you get hit in the stomach, it has to heal, and if you have a concussion, that takes time too. But at least you can watch the progress. It's very hard to watch the imperceptible mending of a broken heart. Maybe this is the first sign of mending. The fact that Mary Agnes's pained solicitude for me this morning happens to strike me as amusing. It was a relaxing day, because Miss Farrow disappeared directly after lunch and did not come back for the rest of the afternoon. But Caroline kept glancing nervously at Mr. Shalimar's closed door, half expecting him to come roaring out of it like a bull into a ring, waving her comment sheet in fury. It was odd that she had thought of a bull, she mused. But perhaps it was because Mr. Shalimar, from the few glimpses she had had of him, looked to her like an aging matador. The stiff posture, shoulders straight, the dark skin, and oddest of all that air he had of someone who has been through a great deal and still has some inner feeling urging him on, but knows that he cannot answer it any longer. He struck her as a troubled man, and not just because of his responsibilities at the office, which would make anyone in charge look bemused at times. It was funny, she thought, that before she had ever had a job, she had always thought of an office as a place where people came to work, but now it seemed as if it was a place where they also brought their private lives for everyone else to look at, paw over, comment on, and enjoy. The typing pool in the center of the 35th floor at Fabian was like the village square, and the offices that surrounded it were like people's homes. Late in the afternoon, she saw something that astonished her. Walking past one of the offices, she noticed through its nearly closed door a girl leaning against the wall of the adjoining office with a water glass pressed against the wall and her ear to the other end of the water glass. On her face was a rapt and gloating expression of an eavesdropper who is hearing what he expected he would hear. Then Caroline realized that the girl was in the office next to Mr. Shalimar's. The girl evidently didn't care who noticed her, since she had not bothered to lock her door, which was probably because she intended to educate everyone in the office later in the day. Caroline wondered whether it was office politics, secrets about the work, or Mr. Shalimar's private life that held her so. At 5 o'clock, April came out of Mr. Shalimar's office and began to put her things together. "Where do you want to eat?" she asked Caroline. "Where do you?" "You know, I'd like to go to Sardi's," April said. "I've heard a lot about it." Caroline looked at April. She was wearing that shiny baby blue gabardine suit again, and tonight, because she was going out, she was even wearing a hat, a dreadful little white felt hat that made her look like Sunday morning in East Cozyville. Caroline felt a pang of self-consciousness at the thought of being seen with her at a good restaurant. It was bad enough to have to go there without dates, but with April in that outfit, with that hair... "Hey," Caroline said, "I'll bet you've never been to the Automat." "Wouldn't you rather go to Sardi's?" April said, sounding disappointed. "Well, it's a little too expensive for me," Caroline lied. "Oh, of course." April's face lighted up with instant sympathy. "I know just what you mean. I shouldn't even go there myself. I have about $4 to last me till payday. I'm so impractical, I guess I'd starve if people like you didn't look out for me." "You'll love the Automat," Caroline said encouragingly. Mr. Shalimar came out of his office with his arm thrown around Mr. Rice's shoulder. They were laughing together. As they passed Caroline's and April's desks, they paused. "Want to stop downstairs for a short drink, April?" Mr. Shalimar said. He glanced at Caroline. "You too." April immediately began to blush. "Oh, we'd love to," she said very softly. "Wouldn't we, Caroline?" "See you downstairs at the Unfriendly Irishman," Mr. Rice said. "Step fast, girls." The two men went off together to the elevator, and April began stuffing her makeup back into her pocketbook, dropping some of it on the floor in her hurry. "The Unfriendly Irishman," April said. "That's what he calls the bar in this building. Isn't he a character?" It was the first time Caroline had ever been in the bar, and she peered through the gloom, looking to see whom she could recognize. The room was about 2/3 full, all with people she had noticed in the elevators and halls of the building. This seemed to be the unofficial Fabian Publications Bar, Refuge, Gathering Place, and 5 o'clock social club. Mr. Shalimar and Mr. Rice were seated at a corner table with drinks in front of them, and they had pulled up 2 extra chairs for Caroline and April. "What'll you have, girls?" Mr. Shalimar said. "Scotch," said Caroline. It was the first thing she could think of. April looked as though she was going through a mental battle. "Me too," she said then, very quickly and softly. She nibbled on a pretzel and began to blush again. "Well, what do you do around here?" Mr. Rice said to Caroline. "I'm working for Miss Farrow this week," she said. He rolled his eyes in mock horror. He had a perfectly deadpan face with a light touch of cynicism on it. "That's Hell Week for the sorority," he said. "We only save it for specially lucky girls." How funny, Caroline thought. That's exactly the phrase I used when I was telling Mary Agnes about it. "So you're Caroline Bender," said Mr. Shalimar. "Yes." Suddenly her mouth was dry. "I found a little report of yours on my desk," he said. "I know." Why did her voice sound like a croak? She took a sip of her drink. "I read the manuscript this afternoon," he said. He paused and looked at her. "You know something, Miss Bender?" "What?" "I happen to agree with you." "Oh my goodness," Caroline said, weak with relief. "I don't think I'll buy that book," he said. "My goodness," she said again. His eyes narrowed. "Make no mistake, I am the editor here, and I buy what I like and reject what I don't like, regardless of what any of my editors say. But I like having a bright young reader who agrees with me. It makes me feel a little better. I hope someday to be a reader, Caroline said. All right. For the next week or two, I'll give you a manuscript every night to take home and read. You give me a report on each one. After I see what you can do, maybe I'll let you be a reader. Oh, that would be marvelous! Mr. Rice smiled wryly. Even with the smile, his face did not change much. The enthusiasm of youth, he said. If old man Fabian had only known, he wouldn't have bothered to pay these kids for working here. He would have charged them. Mr. Shalimar was looking piercingly at Caroline across the table. The most valuable commodity in business today, if people would only recognize it, is enthusiasm. I'm not interested in deadheads. You get the same old trite comments from the deadheads. They don't even care anymore. I want editors who think that every book we put out is an important book. I don't care if it's the worst piece of crap in the world. If the author who wrote it believes in it, and the editors who help him revise it believe in it, then the people who buy it will care about it. The thing that was wrong with the manuscript you read last night was that it was phony. The author thought he was fooling his readers. Well, they never fool me. And he didn't fool you. Do you want experience? Yes, she said. I'll give you experience. I'll teach you. I've been 40 years an editor. I've taught some of the best writers in the business. I knew Eugene O'Neill years ago, and I gave him advice. There was an almost inaudible sigh from April, as if at last she had achieved a moment of delight she had been waiting for a long time. Mr. Shalimar turned to include her too in his revelations. April was looking at him with her eyes shining. Mr. Rice turned his glass of whiskey nearly directly upside down as his throat moved rhythmically, swallowing. His eyes were closed, and he did not seem to be listening to Mr. Shalimar at all. It was 9 o'clock before Caroline realized that none of them had eaten anything but pretzels, and Mr. Rice, not even those. April seemed in a trance, leaning toward Mr. Shalimar as a young plant leans toward the sun in a window, listening to every story he told with little gasps and laughs. Caroline was more interested in Mr. Rice, or Mike, as she was now calling him. His attention to Mr. Shalimar was obviously more loyalty than interest, and she began to suspect that Mike Rice, at least, had heard all Mr. Shalimar's stories quite a few times before. He drank quietly, steadily and pleasantly, the way one plays solitaire or knits a sweater, drink after drink after drink, with no sign of getting drunk. Once in a while, he would look over at her and give a faint smile and nod his head, a serious drinker giving indication that there still is communication between himself and his table partner, but without breaking his rhythm. It was Mr. Shalimar who was finding the liquor hard to take. The first indication Caroline had was a furtive, bony hand touching her knee. The face and voice of Mr. Shalimar above the table were so self-assured and so much the boss that for a moment she had the wild thought that the hand investigating her leg belonged to someone under the table. It hardly even seemed to be connected to Mr. Shalimar's arm and shoulder. Then she caught the thickening of his speech, and he leaned toward her, looking into her face. "Mike, did you ever notice what a beautiful girl this is?" he said. His husky voice terrified her. She moved away from his hand, upsetting her glass in the process. "Oops," Mike said pleasantly. He righted the glass and began to mop off Caroline's skirt with his handkerchief. There was nothing personal in his touch, for which she was grateful. "Miss." He beckoned to the waitress. "Miss." The waitress hurried over with a handful of cloth napkins. Mr. Shalimar seemed oblivious of the entire crisis. He continued to talk, more mistily now, about how lovely Caroline's face was. April began to look confused. She looked up suddenly at Mr. Shalimar with a glance that carried mingled horror and delight. He must have decided to try her knee, Caroline thought, and instantly was taken with a fit of the giggles. She excused herself hurriedly and ran to the ladies' room. April came in a moment after she had achieved her refuge. "Oh, Caroline, are you all right? Are you all right?" Caroline was doubled over, laughing until tears came into her eyes. It wasn't that anything that had happened was so funny, really. It was just that she was so glad to be able to laugh at it all when for nearly 4 hours she had been tense and nervous. "I thought you were sick," April said worriedly. "No, I'm fine. Do you think we can get away now and eat dinner?" "I was thinking, maybe they would buy us dinner. Do you think they might? You want to eat with them?" "Well, neither of us has any money to speak of. It would certainly help for the rest of the week if they bought our dinner tonight. We could go back and say we're hungry and see what develops." "Would you mind?" April asked. "No, I don't mind." She powdered her nose and put on fresh lipstick. "I can stand it if you can." April turned around to look at her, surprised. "You're laughing at him, aren't you?" "Well, you must admit he was funny." "Funny? What was funny?" "I think he's the most fascinating person I ever met." "You do?" Caroline said dubiously. "But the life he's led, the people he knows, I could listen to him talk all night." Caroline couldn't resist saying it. "And he'll let you too, as long as your leg holds out." April's face turned a deep pink. "Oh, my heavens," she said. She covered her face with her hands. Caroline put her arm around April. "He's a little plastered, that's all. Just you never mention it, and he'll never mention it." April smiled a bit ruefully. "I was hoping you and I could have dinner alone together. There are so many things I'd like to talk to you about. I was hoping we could get to know each other better." "We will." "Do you have to go back to the country tonight? Maybe you could stay over at my house?" With the scotch she had drunk, Caroline felt warm and happy and fond of the whole world. "I think that would be fun," she said. She'd never seen the apartment of a working girl who lived alone in New York, but from the fashion magazines she had read, she had her own ideas of it, and already the image arose of herself and April chatting cozily until 4 in the morning in a small, austere but romantically chic apartment, the kind she would like to have someday soon. "It's kind of a dump," April said, "but I love it. I'd love to see it. Come on, out to the wolves." They left the ladies' room and found their way back to their corner table. Mike Rice was sitting there alone. "Mr. Shalimar had to go home," he said. "Oh, what a shame," said April. "We didn't even get a chance to thank him." Caroline glanced at Mike, and for an instant their eyes met. She expected to find a look of amusement there, or at the least his habitual cynicism, but instead, to her surprise, she found a look of caution. "You can tell him tomorrow," he said. "Of course," April murmured. She sat down at her place at the table again and began to toy with her gloves, not quite sure if they were expected to leave now or stay. Mike beckoned to the waitress and pointed at their glasses. Caroline sat down too. For a minute, none of them could think of anything to say. "You have to understand, Mr. Shalimar," Mike said finally. There was something about Mike Rice that Caroline liked. She felt she could say anything to him, and he would never be shocked or think she was getting out of her place. "Maybe I'm way out of line," she said, "but I had the feeling he's had a come down, and he's ashamed of it. The way he talks about the past all the time and about what he was." "You might as well know it," Mike said. "I suspect you're going to be around a long time. It isn't as if he's had a come down from anything. He's never been anywhere." "But all the people he's known," Caroline said, "the stories he tells, why, he never stops talking about Eugene O'Neill." There was not a trace of a smile on Mike's face, only a look of great pity. It was odd, Caroline thought, that a man in the shape he was in should feel sorry for someone like Mr. Shalimar. "You know how it is when people talk all the time about some celebrity," he said. "Mr. Shalimar knows Eugene O'Neill, but Eugene O'Neill doesn't know him." My gosh, April said, biting her thumb. Be nice girls, Mike said. Forget I ever opened my mouth, but treat Mr. Shalimar with all the respect you have at your command. He's a very bitter man, but he has cause. It's a dreadful thing to know you're 55 years old and you have to worry all the time about losing a job that isn't even good enough for you. Why should he lose his job? Caroline asked. Bright young people, people like you, for instance, kids with ambition, who write brilliant reports out of sheer instinct. A man who has to live in a past that never really was is afraid of a lot of things. But not of me? Caroline said incredulously. Not you now, no. Right now you're nothing to him. But you in another 2 years, that's a different story. Listen to him. Pay attention and respect him when he teaches you anything about the business you're in. Don't think you're smart. Just listen and remember. He had begun to slur his words, and Caroline realized that he was, finally, very drunk. He pulled a handful of crumpled bills out of his pocket and dropped them onto the table. This'll pay for the drinks and probably a sandwich for you 2 kids, he said. He put his hands flat on the table and assisted himself to his feet. See you tomorrow. Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Rice, April said. Yes, thank you, Caroline murmured. She was troubled and thinking. She didn't want to be a success if that meant watching out for people with dark lives who were afraid of you for no reason you could fathom. This morning she had been afraid even to speak to Mr. Shalimar. This evening, he was fondling her leg, and she was being told that someday he would be afraid of her. She was thinking that she didn't like the working world at all, and yet, underneath, she was exhilarated. It was all like a dream in which you could have anything you wanted, if you were very, very careful. Mike Rice leaned over and touched her eyebrows where they were drawn together. His fingers were very gentle. Did I say, don't think you're smart? He said. I'll tell you something. I'll amend it. Don't let anyone know you think you're smart. Because you know something, you're damn smart. He patted her cheek and walked off swiftly, making an obvious effort to walk straight, his camel's hair coat tossed askew over one shoulder like a cape. What's he talking about? April asked, looking after him. I don't know, Caroline said. Yet. They ate at the same bar, and then Caroline telephoned her mother and bought a toothbrush and went with April to April's apartment. There was a baby carriage in the downstairs hallway and 2 garbage cans and a row of mailboxes on one wall. As they climbed the stairs, Caroline heard the sound of a television set from one apartment and shrieks from another where a party was going on. The door was ajar at the party apartment. Look, April nudged Caroline. Everyone's so friendly in this house, you could walk right in. It's so smoky in there they probably wouldn't know the difference. April's apartment was dark. She switched on the light and ran to the window. Look at my garden, Caroline. Caroline was looking at the room. It was tiny, and April's clothes were scattered here and there. There was a coffee cup with some cold coffee in it, standing on the bridge table next to a pile of all the latest fashion magazines. There were 2 doors, one of which might have led off to another room, since there was no bed in sight. In fact, there was almost no furniture, and no rug. It was seedy, you had to admit that, but Caroline felt her heart begin to pound. It could be fixed up so easily, and it could be enchanting. How wonderful to have an apartment of one's own things around, one's own taste everywhere. The bed is in the wall, April said. I'll sleep on the box spring and you can have the mattress. Here's my bathroom and this is the closet. This closet is the kitchen. Come see my garden, Caroline. Caroline looked out the window, down 3 floors, and saw dimly the outline of trees. They were spindly city trees, it was true, and it was hardly April's garden except to look at. But as soon as she saw it, Caroline was sold. I love your apartment. You're so lucky. Do you think so? April's face lighted up with delight. I was afraid you'd think it was a dirty old tenement. I didn't expect you to live in a penthouse on $50 a week. Oh, I know. It's just terrible not to have enough money. I can't even go to the movies at night after I get finished paying for my rent and phone and food. I have to sit here every night and read magazines. I met a girl who lives in this house and works at Fabian. Her name is Barbara Lamont. She's secretary to the beauty editor of America's Woman, and she's going to give me all the fashion magazines when she gets through reading them. They get all the magazines free over there. I've started to read some already. April smiled self-consciously, like a child. You know what? I'm getting an education. Do you want some cocoa? Love some. April began to putter around in her closet kitchen, making cocoa. I would never have met Barbara at Fabian because she works on a different floor. It's like a different world down there. My heavens, they have a regular kitchen on the 31st floor where they make all the recipes they take pictures of. Most of the food they can't even eat afterward because they put coloring on it to photograph better. Isn't that a terrible waste? But sometimes they let the girls take home something wonderful, like a roast turkey. I think I ought to ask for a transfer. If I sound like I'm drooling, it's because I am. I'm always hungry lately. I'm not used to eating just a box of Fig Newtons for supper. Back home, we used to have enormous meals. She put the 2 cups of cocoa on the bridge table, swept a pile of clothes off one of the bridge chairs, kicked off her shoes, and sat down. Caroline took the other chair. I wish, April went on, that I would meet a boy who would take me out to dinner and be good to me. Who am I kidding? I wouldn't care if he never took me out to dinner, just as long as we liked each other a lot. Do you know that Barbara Lamont is only 20 years old, our age, and she's already been married and divorced and has a baby 1-year-old? Did you see that baby carriage downstairs? That's hers. She's trying to sell it. She doesn't have any money either. Nobody I know has any money. That's kind of sad about the baby carriage, Caroline said. Most people save baby carriages for the next baby. It's a little as if she doesn't expect to get married again. It is, isn't it? April said. But I guess she doesn't have room for it. None of the apartments in this house are very big. She lives with her mother and the baby. Her father's dead. I bet she has a hard time on dates. Being married before, you know. I know, Caroline said. She was curled up cozily in the chair with her arms around her knees, and she hadn't had cocoa since she was a little girl. She was beginning to have that feeling that comes after midnight, of one's thoughts opening out, flowering, groping out loud for some new discovery, some new truth that is really as old as all the hundreds of years girls have been confiding to one another in the relaxing intimacy of the night. Boys are funny. They seem to think that girls who have been married before can't live without sex. I wonder if it's true. Do you think so? I wonder too, April said. She turned her cocoa cup around in her hand, looking at the roses that were painted on it as if they were very fascinating. Are you a virgin? I must admit I am. Are you? Oh, sure. What do you mean, admit? None of the girls back home will admit they aren't, if they aren't, which I don't know. I'm not so proud of it, Caroline said. It's just something I can't quite bring myself to give up. If my mother heard me talking about this in such a casual way, she'd have a fit. She taught me only 2 major rules for life. Don't let boys touch you, and join the Radcliffe Club. April smiled. Mine never taught me anything like that, because we just don't talk about sex at our house. You just assume that every girl who isn't married is a virgin, unless there's somebody who there's a scandal about. My mother would no more tell me not to sleep with a boy than she would tell me not to go out and steal a car. She knows I wouldn't think of it. But you do think of it? I think about it. All the time. That's a little different, though. When I'm 26, if I'm not married by then, I'm going to take a lover, Caroline said. Really? April sounded a little shocked. Then she thought about it. I think you're right. If you're that old, you have a right to live. I wanted to sleep with Eddie. Caroline said. He was my fiancé in college. I really wanted to, but at the last minute I was always afraid. I think it was a combination of being afraid I'd lose him and being scared that going all the way wasn't going to be as wonderful as everything I'd always imagined. I guess people build it up in their minds as being something marvelous, and then they wait, and then it gets to be too important. Like the first kiss, or the first anything. It ought to be an accident, not something you plan too carefully, or else you're apt to be disappointed. I guess this sounds awfully naive, April said. But when I try to picture going to bed with somebody, I can never figure out where the sheet and blankets go. Do you do it underneath the blanket, or do you take the blanket off? Caroline couldn't help laughing. Didn't you ever neck on a bed with somebody? My heavens, no. Not on a bed. Well, when the time comes, whoever he is, he'll know what to do about the blanket. They were silent then for a few moments, each with her own thoughts. If you were to take a lover next week, April said, just pretend, who would you want it to be? What kind of man would you want for your first? Someone I loved, Caroline said, and above all, someone considerate who had enough experience to know what he was doing. Someone older, April said. I think it should be an older man. Not too old. Oh no, but not 21 either. Just pretend that you could have anybody and you had made up your mind to have a love affair. Who would you want? It could be a movie star or someone in the office or anyone. All right, Caroline said. Do you know? All of a sudden, she did know, and the choice seemed as natural as if she had always known it, and as exciting as if it were crazily, improbably possible. This is just pretend, mind you. Of course. Mike Rice, said Caroline.